different way. Look at anti-cruelty laws. You know, they say, oh, you have to treat animals humanely and you can't inflict unnecessary suffering on them. Most of them either have explicit exemptions and say, of course, this doesn't apply to animals used for food, animals used in hunting, animals used in science, animals used in rodeos, animals used in circus. They have all these exemptions. Or if they don't have exemptions, and some don't, if they don't have exemptions, when courts interpret them, what they basically say is, well, how are we supposed to figure out what's necessary and unnecessary? So we're going to look to the industry. And there are all these cases where people are challenging horrible things that we do to food animals. And the courts say, well, we look at the industry and we assume they're rational and we assume they wouldn't impose more damage on their property than they have to. So we have to assume that you know, the way that these food animals are treated is necessary because rational. We have to assume that the industry's rational. We have to assume that why would industry, why would these farmers, why would these factory farmers, why would these individuals, these property owners, why would they impose more suffering than is necessary? Because that would be like going out and taking a hammer and denting your car for no reason. I mean, why would you wouldn't do that. If you saw one of your friends bashing a car with a hammer, you would say, well, you know, obviously stress has gotten to this person and you know, this person's acting irrationally. Why? Because this person is engaged in conduct which is resulting in a diminution of value of that person's property. Okay, and it's irrational. Similarly, the courts say, well, you know, I mean, yes, they dehorn. There was there are cases involving dehorning, for example, which is, you know, they take the horns out. They do it in different ways, but one of the ways that they do it is they put acid on the bud on the calf, and that causes the horn, because they don't want the animals to grow horns, because when they're in close confinement, they'll injure each other. So you know, you have cases where, you know, courts will say, well, you know, yes, this involves pain, but we have to assume that they wouldn't be using, you know, they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't have a good reason, and if there was another way to do it, you know, they would probably do it, because, you know, why would they use this caustic substance on these animals if they didn't think it was absolutely necessary to do so? And so basically, if you want to know what animal welfare laws and regulations do to help animals, we're going to do a little experiment. Close your eyes. What do you see? And that's what animal welfare laws do. Nothing. Okay? I mean, look, the bottom line is, not only have they phased in over like millions of years, but the bottom line is, most of these reforms, if you look at them, it's like the difference between being waterboarded on a bare waterboard and being waterboarded on a padded waterboard. Is there a difference? Well, yeah, there's padding, but I mean, waterboarding is still waterboarding, you know. And so I mean, for example, I always boggle when I have people say to me, well, don't you think cage-free eggs are better than conventional battery eggs? And the answer is, have you ever seen a cage-free operation? Go and look at one. They're all over the place. I suspect you got a zillion of them up here in Canada. But I mean, you know, go and look at one. It's like the difference between being in a small battery cage and being in one large, huge, gargantuan battery cage. I mean, it's horrible. They're still debeaking the animals. The animals are still crowded in. They're still walking on each other, still pecking each other, still peeing on each other, crapping on each other. It's dreadful, you know. And the idea that people say, well, this is better, and you know, and you end up with these sorts of weird discussions about, well, you know, yeah, it's better, you know, if you beat the slave 20 times a week than 21 times a week, but, you know, yeah, obviously less suffering is better than more suffering, sure, but that doesn't answer the fundamental moral question, can we justify this at all? And I think, you know, I mean, I come to my conclusion, you come to yours, but the second thing that I think is bizarre about the animal welfare, the conventional wisdom position, reflected in the animal welfare approach, which allows us to feel comfortable and to think that we are different from poor Michael Vick, is that this idea that it's all right for us to use animals as long as, you know, I mean, I've just argued that we can't treat them humanely. As a matter of fact, I believe that the concept of humane treatment is as close to fantasy as we find in the real world. But this idea that we have, the idea that Bentham has, the idea that Singer has, the idea that many of us have, that animals don't have an interest, they're sentient, but they don't have an interest in continuing to live because they're not self-aware. Now, I find that really peculiar. And indeed, I see that as like it's one of the things that I said, well, if you want to eat meat and you want to drink milk and you have that cheese pizza and the eggs and all that other stuff, you will tell yourself whatever insane thing you need to tell yourself, including that animals aren't self-aware. Now, are animals aware in the way that we are aware? You know, it's hard to know what goes on in the mind of an animal because we are animals that use symbolic communication, language, okay? So, you know, our cognition is very closely tied. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't say closely tied, I would say it's identical to the concepts that we have in our minds, which are linked to language. Now, animals don't use symbolic communication. So, do they have concepts? Or do they think? Are they, you know, I mean, and the answer is, well, they clearly think. I mean, you know, you can't, I mean, I find that, I remember like a year or two ago, I was in a checkout, and there was a National Geographic, and it said on the front, there was a picture of a border collie. I live with a border collie, and it was can animals think? And I turned to Anna and I said, that strikes me as bizarre a question as, do dogs have tails? You know, you look, you want to know if a dog has a tail, you look at the dog, and the dog has a, you know, obviously, you know, it's like, this is not rocket science, a question. And you know, but do animals think? The answer is, of course they think. The question is, what is it that they think about? And to the extent that we think that their moral status depends on their ability to be self-aware and have a concept of a life, to value their lives, you know, that's the question. Now, I do not believe as an empirical matter that I don't believe as an empirical matter that animals live in an eternal present, that they have no memories of the past or no expectations of the future. I don't think that that's, I mean, we have 5 rescue dogs, I watch them a lot, and I watch their behavior, and I can't possibly explain the behaviors that I see. I can't, there's no way I can rationally understand how they behave without attributing to them memories of the past and expectations of the future, you know? And it's, you know, we tend to sort of say, well, you know, they do things by instinct. I don't know what the hell instinct means, and it's like one of those words, we've got nothing else to say instinct. You know, but my border collie, for example, Katie, who is a vegan also, we are all vegans in the house, and Katie has got to be at least 19 years old. She's old, she's really old, and she's still in fairly decent shape as a vegan, and every afternoon, she, at a particular time, she lets me know she wants to go in the car for a ride. And if my keys are someplace where she can get them, she will bring them and she will drop them. And what's interesting to me is she always comes at the same time, and it's not, you can't say, well, she sees what time, you know, she looks outside and she sees, you know, it's instinct. She looks outside and she sees, you know, where the sun is or whatever, and the answer is no, that's not true, because she'll do it. She does it at the same time, whether we're on Eastern Standard Time, whether we're on Daylight Saving Time, it doesn't really matter. She does it, you know. So obviously she has some sense of expectation. She wants to do, you know, I'll tell you another story that just, actually, I conveyed this thing to a philosopher friend of mine who used it in a book he wrote, because it was great. When we first got, we had another border collie that we rescued, and her name was Chelsea. And Chelsea, when she first came to the house, she had a disability. She had basically one leg that didn't work, and so and that's why she wasn't getting adopted, and so we took her. And so at that time we had 7 dogs with Chelsea, and we only have 5 now. We sort of decided that after 5 they know that they really outnumber you, and they develop a gang mentality. So we get Chelsea, and we were, at that time, we had a number of, you know, we had a lot of dogs, and most of them slept on the bed. And so Chelsea comes over. She had a hard time getting up on the bed, so we had to put up a little stool up for her to jump on to get on the bed. But by the time she did that, everybody else was on the bed, and she didn't really have much space to get on the bed. So this was this was like, I guess, the second night we had her. She starts barking, and she runs to the back door. and all the other dogs jump off the bed and they run to the back door. And and so I get out of bed and I'm thinking, well, they want to go outside. And when you have 7 dogs, if they want to go outside, you don't argue with that. And so I open the door, I let them all outside, and Chelsea doesn't go. She lets them all run outside. And then they're all outside, and they're barking at whatever the hell she told them she saw. I close the door, and she runs back to the bedroom, jumps on the stool, gets on the bed. So now I'm getting freaked out. And I'm thinking, wow. Wow. And she did it constantly. She did it until they caught on. I mean, she did it a number of times. And it was very clear that there was, that she understood that she was going to tell them that they're, however she was thinking about it. And I'm sure she's not thinking in terms of words of, well, what I'll do is I'll tell them, but she's obviously behaving with expectations that are really quite interesting and complex. So I don't believe for a second that animals live in this eternal present that Jeremy Bentham or Peter Singer believe that they live in. I don't think that that's true at all. But you know what? We're never going to solve the issue of animal minds because we have no access to them. We have no access to each other's minds. I have no idea what you think. When you say you're in pain, I think I understand what you mean because I understand what I mean when I say that, but I have no idea what you think when you say it. And so we don't really have access to each other's minds. And to the extent that we believe that we are confident that we do understand what's going on in each other's heads, it's because we use language and we think that everybody else understands things the way we do, and which leads to lots of misunderstanding, actually. But we think we have access to each other's minds. We don't, but we don't really know what the hell goes on. And I have no idea. My dogs think. I have no doubt about that. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I have no idea how they think, and I don't understand what it means to think without concepts which are linked to language, because that's the only way I can think. So, this is the only way I can do it. So if I'm trying to figure out how another species is doing it, I have no idea, because the only way I know how to do it is through a mechanism that they don't have. But it's absolutely clear from their behavior that they have some mechanism which is equivalent. I just don't know what it is. Okay? Now, let's assume that animals are in an eternal present. So let's not argue with Jeremy Bentham. Well, we can't argue with him. He's dead. But let's not argue with Jeremy Bentham. Let's not argue with Peter Singer. And let's just assume, for argument purposes, that there is, that animals live in an eternal present. Does that mean they're not self-aware? And the answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. Some years ago, I read a book. I read several of them. But several years ago, I read a book written by a neurosurgeon named Antonio Damasio, who at the time I think he was at Iowa, and he wrote a book in which he described a phenomenon that absolutely intrigued me called transient global amnesia, in which people have a form of amnesia where they remember nothing about the past and they're unable to make plans for the future. But he made the point of saying they have a very strong sense of themselves right in the present. So I actually arranged to meet some people who agreed to meet with me, who had TGA. And it's fascinating because they're just like, they you wouldn't know it until you started, they talk perfectly fine. It's not that they're incapacitated in any way. They just, if you ask them, what did you do 5 minutes ago? They don't remember. If you say, what are you going to do in 5 minutes? They don't know. They're unable to think in that way. They don't have future-oriented thinking. They don't have past-focused thinking. But they are aware. What you can ask them questions about what they're doing right now, and you can say, are you do you enjoy life? Oh yeah, oh yeah. So even if they're in this eternal present, they want to get to the next second, to the next second, to the next second, to the next second. Is that self-awareness? Yes. Is it self-awareness like the self-awareness that you and I have? No. But is it self-awareness? Yes. Is it morally relevant that they have a different form of self-awareness? Depends what the question is. If the question is, Brock wants to hire a history professor, should they hire somebody who's got transient global amnesia or somebody who doesn't? The answer is, Well, obviously, if you want a person to be able to teach history in an effective way, it's probably best not to hire the person who's got transient global amnesia. But if it's a different question, who do we use as an unconsenting subject in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor? The answer is you don't use either. You know, I mean, and so we see this where humans are involved. We see that, well, you know, yeah, that's a different sort of self-awareness. And it may be morally relevant, but it's not morally relevant for treating that person who's got transient global amnesia exclusively as a resource to benefit people who don't. But with animals, we say, well, you know, they're not aware. And the answer is, of course they're aware. Of course they have a set, of course, I mean, look, to be sentient means you're subjectively aware. To be sentient means you know when you're experiencing pain, it's you who's experiencing it and not some third party. That's all the self-awareness you need, as far as I'm concerned, to have the right not to be used as exclusively as a resource for humans. Okay? I mean, and it's also, it's a bizarre way of thinking. You know, if I were to say to you, well, we have eyes, but do we have an interest in continuing to see? You would say, well, that's a stupid question, because it is. You know, you have eyes. To say that, do you have an interest in continuing to see? The answer is, of course you do. You know, your eyes are intended, you know, your eyes are a means to the end of a certain sort of perception of seeing things. Okay? So to ask whether or not you have an interest in continuing to see is a strange question. Similarly, sentience, to say, does a sentient being have an interest in continuing to live? Sentience is a means to the end of existence. It is continuing to live. It is a way that certain beings, it's a thing that certain beings use to give themselves information to determine what to avoid and what to pursue. So to say X is sentient, but X does not have an interest in continuing to live, is to completely misunderstand the nature of sentience and what sentience is. And it's like saying, you have eyes, but I'm really bewildered. You have an interest in continuing to see. It's as absurd. It's as absolutely absurd. So I think the two pieces of our conventional wisdom, you know, that we get from the animal welfare ethic, that where humans and animals are concerned, that animals have lesser moral value than humans do because they're not self-aware, nonsense. And the other piece, that we have a moral obligation that we owe directly to animals not to make them suffer unnecessarily. The response to that is, as long as animals are chattel property, that's an impossible thing to do. Okay? So the way, our justification for thinking we're different from Michael Vick, and that really we're humane people, and we have this humane ethic, and that we believe it's right to use animals, but we think it's, you know, we think you have to treat them humanely, blah, 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 falls apart completely. Brings us right back to Michael Vick. The bottom line is, if you think that what Michael Vick did was wrong, and everybody in this room I'm sure does, if you think it's morally wrong, you are obligated. It's not something you ought to think about. You are obligated right now, at this moment, on Friday afternoon or whatever time it is, you are obligated to stop eating, wearing, and using them. You cannot regard animals as having moral value and continue to exploit them. However nicely you exploit them, you can't do it. They're either things or they're non-human persons, by which I mean simply beings who have morally significant interests. So they either have morally significant interests or they don't. If they don't, what are you doing here? You know, and if they do, then you have an obligation not to use them as resources, which means we have to accord to them, for all intents and purposes, a right not to be treated as property, which means we stop eating, whatever else we do, we stop eating, wearing, and using them. Now, would any of you like to ask questions about plants? Thank you, I appreciate that.